Hi everyone, I'm David Huberman. I am a network operator, part of the team that run Oracle's bare metal cloud. Similar to Amy's presentation, I'm going to talk about buying IP addresses in the market, but this is going to be a walkthrough for anyone here or anyone watching who needs to buy IP addresses. And it's funny, because you saw Amy's pricing slide. Everyone thinks they're buying and selling at the right time. It's funny how that works. All right, basics, we all know this. There are buyers and sellers, there are brokers, there are operators of the exchange, there are lawyers. We're going to talk a lot about that. And there are RIRs and national registries, especially if you're in APNIC. My pricing looks a little different than Amy's. Right now, IP addresses in the small range can be up to $30 an IP address, and it's wholly dependent on supply. There are times, there are months where there's nothing to buy. You're going to pay more, and there are months where there's a lot to buy, and you're going to pay less. It's a little bit slower, less volatile in the medium range. Today, if you were to buy space right now in October 2016, you could get a /16 for about 10 or 11 bucks. If you are dealing with a seller with desirable space who's very astute, you're going to pay more. And then there's the large blocks. Large blocks, 8 to 10 bucks right now, $14, $15. But look out, because I'm seeing the prices rise very, very fast in the large blocks. So before you get to the market, you need to know before you go. You know how much you want to buy and how long it's going to last, right? Model it out, figure out what you need. Because then you got to go to your company and you have to secure your CapEx. And the CapEx is not only your purchase price, but it's two things you're not going to know, which are your transaction fees with the registry, with escrow agents, which cost money, and fees that you may be paying to a broker or to an exchange. And after you get your CapEx, the most important part of this whole process is if you've got to find M&A lawyers. This is not going and buying $500 million worth of Infinera gear, okay? Nobody in your company knows what you're talking about when you say, I need counsel for buying IP addresses. They don't know what that is. And what you tell them is it's M&A activity. You're making an acquisition of somebody else's intellectual property. Purchase price seems to matter a lot, but it's actually one of the least important parts of the deal. The terms and conditions, the covenants, the representations, the warranties are the most important part. When you're a buyer, you need to purchase an asset and you need to protect your company while you're doing this. And by the way, that costs money. You're going to need significant operating capital to pay for these M&A lawyers. As Amy said, just keep in mind what's going on in the RIRs. You cannot buy space in LACNIC or AFRINIC and move it out of the registry, nor, if you're operating in those regions, can you move space you purchase in ARIN, APNIC, or RIPE into LACNIC or AFRINIC. And if you have to do that, which some of us do, that's just going to add complexity into the terms and conditions of your contract. Have your RIR account ready to receive the addresses. Amy talked about that. I'll move on. The regulatory framework, and the reason I put this in here is the very first paragraph of an asset purchase agreement. The lawyer needs to know what words to use. What is it you're buying? Well, if you're buying IP addresses in ARIN land, you're not buying an asset. You're buying a license for a slot in a database, okay? In RIPE, you're pretty much buying an asset as far as that legal regime is concerned. And APNIC's very clear, they don't care, but it's probably an asset to be bought and sold. In LACNIC and AFRINIC, to the best of my knowledge, these are undefined terms. I work for big companies, so I wanted to put in some interesting notes for buyers who work at typical big companies. You need to teach finance how to book it. These are intangible assets. They go on what's called an amortization schedule. It'll be amortized for a certain number of years, which is dependent on the accounting practices of your finance department. They'll let you know. Transactions are not closed with a PO. You're not going to go get a purchase requisition and turn that into a PO. You have to do it with a wire transfer. I don't know about you, but figuring out how to do a wire transfer to a big company for the first time is not the easiest thing. So you go make a friend over in Corp Dev and the M&A folks, and you learn how they do wires, or you go out and find people in the treasury who control the cash in your company, and you make a friend and they help you, and they're ready to initiate a wire when you're ready to send one. So now you got to go find a seller. Brokers are not your friend. Brokers and exchange operators are very valuable as a buyer and as a seller. This is a silly market. Buyers don't talk to buyers, sellers don't talk to sellers, the sellers don't know who the buyers are, and the buyers don't know who the sellers are. Think about that. You want to go buy a Slash 18 right now, and you don't want to deal with a broker. Where are you going to buy it from? How do you know who's selling? Nobody talks to anybody. So the brokers and exchange operators are hugely important. But understand, they're not here to help your network operate, they're here to make money. They want the prices to rise over time. You want to pay as little as possible, so your interests are not aligned. Keep control. You're in control. If you let people tell you what to do and how to do it and it doesn't work for you, you're the one who's on the wrong side of the transaction. Deal making is about people. This is just like peering and transit. People will sell to you and accede to your terms if they like you. And they like you if they know you. And if they know you, it's because you've gone to them or you've met with them and you're face to face. I mean, think about how much we get done here at Ananog because we talk to each other and we see each other. Email doesn't work for this stuff a lot of the time. And you have to be cognizant that it's not just North America. In some cultures around this world, email is not an acceptable medium for business. You've got to do it face to face. The more money you spend, the more time you need to be on a plane. When you get to the deal, it's about price. It's about the timing of the delivery, as Amy was talking about. And as I've been harping on, it's about the terms and conditions of the contract. There's a bullet point here. We can give you 90% of the space now, but we're going to need a few months to finish cleaning up the other 10%. You're going to see this a lot. A lot of blocks of IP addresses, they're not quite ready to go. So, protecting your company. When you're doing your due diligence, there's technical due diligence. RIPE RIS, the Routing Information Service, is the best tool you will have during this process. It tells you about the history of the routing. It talks about block lists. It talks about registration history. The last point there, is the seller routing the block internally? You'd be surprised how many people sell IP addresses from the CFO's office without actually asking the ops folks. And the ops folks are like, dude, what are you doing? We're using these. It happens a lot. The legal ones we've talked about. Make sure the IP addresses aren't under contractual obligation. I mention this because this keeps happening to me because I keep buying from defense contractors. Defense contractors have some contracts that are really, really old, and it's some military division way far away from what they can see, and that division's using the IP addresses. So you really want to make sure that your seller doesn't have obligations to the IP addresses that they may not even know about until you ask the question. The last thing I want to talk about is fraud. I've been doing this for 3.5 years. I have bought a lot of IP addresses from a lot of different companies, through brokers, through direct, and I'm going to tell you, 30% of this market is fraud. There are two types of fraud we're going to talk about today. Willful fraud, where they're trying to screw you, and unwitting fraud, where they're completely trying to act in good faith and they're just messing up. Willful fraud is pretty upfront. They're selling space that's not theirs. They're selling non-registered space. You get an exhibit, it's got 10 blocks on it, not all of it's actually registered. They're selling space that they hijacked from the RIR, which Amy talked about. Or the worst kind, which is they're intentionally selling space that they had to lie to the RIR to get. When you're buying a big block from a company you've never heard of, from a person you've never met, ask yourself, why are they selling, how did they get this large block and why are they selling it? Then there's the more interesting unwitting fraud. There's a lot of merger and acquisition activity, especially in North America. And you'd be surprised how many folks think they have space, but they don't. They're selling you space that's in their name, but it's actually through mergers and acquisition belongs to a different company. This is where your lawyers and your due diligence are very important. And then there's big corporation problems. 3 times I have bought IP address space from employees that tried to buy a space from employees at a company who were selling it through a broker, and it turns out that department didn't control the IP addresses. A different broker and a different set of employees in a different department actually have control of the IP addresses. And that's really annoying when that happens. Fraud can be avoided by counting on your lawyers and by using your common sense as a network operator and as an engineer. Rigorously vet your seller. Do not buy from any company or any party that you don't already know or you can't easily find out about. There are 2 countries where I'm going to advise you not to buy address space from for 2 very different reasons. Do not buy address space from Romania, ladies and gentlemen. It's fraud. Okay? Tell you that right now. Not going to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of space for sale. It's all space you don't want anything to do with if you want to protect your company, which is our responsibility. The second, for a very different reason, be very careful if a Chinese company is offering to sell you IP addresses. IP addresses in China sell all the time to other Chinese companies, bigger Chinese companies. China Mobile has 880 million handsets. You think they need some IP addresses? When IP addresses go for sale in China, they buy them, or companies like them buy them. They're not going to sell to companies outside of China. So if someone's trying to sell it to you, it's probably not real. Amy talked about escrow agents. They're very important. Brokers and exchange operators like to tell you who to use as an escrow agent. Only use a major bank, please. Don't use an escrow agent you've never heard of. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Amy, if you want to come join us, we're going to open the microphone to questions. We have quite a bit of time, so don't be shy. If you have any statements, questions, if you think there's an experience that you want to share that could actually help enrich the conversation. Thank you.
Teddy Vandenberg from SoftLayer. What control has an individual lost due to the marketplace taking up all IP address assignments and sales?
What control has an individual lost?
Right, because the RIRs used to be able to actually dictate how IP addresses were used in the past, and now it's not as much control.
Can you be more specific? Because I don't understand the question. So the RIRs have their policies, right? And later this week, starting tonight, Aaron has their meeting, and we, the community, we set the policies, right? And we all have to live under those policy regimes. There's what we've created. Individuals never had control over that. Corporation, the network operator does. The IP addresses always belong to the operators. Some really old ones belong to, Carl Auerbach or an individual like that. But for the most part, they were always registered to companies, and they were an asset of the company, ignoring the asset stuff. So what kind of control were you looking for?
I guess I was more concerned about smaller corporations not having the same access as the larger corporations.
You mean to the RIR policy development process? Is that what you're?
So small companies, that's where most of the market is, right? Most of the market is in the buying and selling of /24s, and these are with generally smaller entities. And they don't have any different control than a large company might. So I feel like the market works for the sellers and it works for the buyers because we're able to do these transactions. And while we stood up here and we were giving you things to look out for and things you want to be careful of, it really does work. And if you have a /24 that you have control of and it is really rightfully you're the registrant of, you can sell it to whomever you want. And I, as a buyer, can buy from whoever I want. And the RIRs aren't in the way of that at all. as far as I can see.
Sure. So I handle a ton of really small sales. I run an auction platform specifically aimed at small buyers and small sellers, where we automate the contract process to get a lot of the hurdles that the big guys have to deal with and all of the lawyers out of the way for these smaller deals. And they still have to go through the ARIN transfer process, and it's a little bit more difficult for them sometimes because they tend not to have as much experience as the operators handling the larger companies, and they haven't gone through the process of getting space directly from ARIN. So sometimes that's an extra hurdle for them to have to deal with, but they can still participate in the policy development process like anybody else can. You can participate on the PPML, you can come to the meetings and talk if you have a problem with the policies and how they're applying to your organization. So I don't see there being a huge difference between the large guys and the small guys, other than the extra hurdle of getting your head around going through the transfer process that you might not have done before.
Okay, thanks.
Middle microphone.
Thank you. Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire. Question for you. First, two quick things. The first one is the ARIN Who Was service. It wasn't really mentioned there. Have either of you used that service as a way of looking back at the last 25 years of history related to blocks? Is that within the terms, things like that? Because it was a little ambiguous to me. If, as part of a transfer, a buyer could look at the Who Was data, if that's allowed in the terms, and if you've used it in the past, I'd really be curious about that.
So I don't believe that's technically allowed under the terms. I've seen Who Was used for slightly different purposes, and then people that had gotten approval for a slightly different purpose use it for that purpose as well. I'm not sure. I mean, you would probably have a better.
In that vein, I use two tools. As I talked about, I use RIPE RIS because I want to look at the routing history. I want to see which ASs originated routes for the IP addresses I'm buying for as far back as history goes. And RIS goes back decades. It's wonderful. Who Was, as you're alluding to, is great because in ARIN, it shows you the registration history at each step, which you can match up to the routing history. So you put those two tools together, and that's a fantastic tool for seeing the big picture of a block.
Thank you. And I guess the second part is a little bit of a statement. Just to be aware that within ARIN, we do have reserved blocks, and there is a policy right now that would lock those up and prevent them being used in part of the transfer market. So it's also very important to know if a block is part of a lockdown. So in TPIA, as an example, you weren't allowed to transfer it for 3 years, but there's no way to necessarily know that without really digging into it.
Yeah, and that's, as buyers, as engineers, as operators, we can't be expected to know every little detail about every RIR's rules and every block's history. And that's where, as Amy was saying in her presentation, it's all about protecting yourself in the terms and conditions. Can you get your money back if something went wrong?
Hi, John Kristoff with DePaul University. Two brief questions. You can choose who wants to answer this. The first, you mentioned 30% fraud, and I was wondering if there's any additional pattern to that. Like, should I be more leery of fraud occurring with a /16 versus a /24 or not? Or does it not really necessarily matter? Second question is, if I'm a one-man shop and I've got a need for just maybe a couple of /24s, it's a few $100, just based on my quick judgment of what it might cost me, at least just for the address space. Lawyers, that sounds really expensive for just those two small, relatively assets. Do you still recommend going through an elaborate lawyer process, or how involved do I need to get legal representation? I know you're not a lawyer, but what might I expect for legal representation, even for relatively small purchases in that space?
All right, so your first question was about the fraud in big versus small. Amy?
Sure. So I'd say for the most part with the very large blocks, I see a little bit less fraud, especially if it comes from a /8 holder, because there are pretty clear records there, and the holders of very large amounts of space tend to be very large organizations where you can do a bit more diligence with. I see more fraud going on with the smaller blocks, especially smaller than a /16. I'd say once you get /20 and smaller, you see quite a bit more. So you just need to be careful about who you're dealing with. Make sure that you get chain of title history where it's there, and just make sure you use escrow and other ways to make sure your funds don't go over ahead of time. And as far so with the really small sales, I don't use lawyers. I don't really see a lot of organizations using lawyers with the really small sales just because the dollar amount is so low that it's just not reasonable for them to do so. Whatever money they would lose from doing that is typically less than the cost of attorneys being involved in that. Again, just use escrow.
Yeah, it's about your tolerance for risk. No one here is going to tell you when to use and when not to use a lawyer. That's up to you. But it's what's your tolerance for risk. At $15 an IP address, it's over $4,000 for a /24. Does that $4,000 plus the time you put in, does that mean a lot to you? If it does, then you spend a little bit more and protect yourself more. If it's negligible, then you are open to more risk. This, in the scenario you've outlined, this is where brokers and exchange operators are very, very helpful, because their interest isn't just moving, right, volume, and they want a successful market because it's good for their business. This is where they can really be a help. For the small /24 transfers, once you've agreed on price and you're okay with the price you're paying, your brokers and exchange operators have done this. They've iterated it over and over, and I'm feel pretty confident saying you're probably in good hands if you've picked a good broker or exchange.
Sure, and our reputations are at stake with these too, because we do so many of these. It's not like this is a one-time deal where we're in and out. So we do have quite a bit of vetting that goes on before we even engage a seller, because we would hate to be in a situation where we perpetuated some sort of fraudulent activity, because our reputation is tied to what we're doing here.
I had a statement and a question. We're using my own mic. Donnie Roisman with SoftLayer. Just two statements I wanted to echo a bit. One statement I wanted to echo a bit. The value of brokers or exchange operators is definitely huge. These are experts in the market. Many companies maybe would complete 1, 2, 3 transactions over a multi-year period. These exchange operators and brokers are moving a multiple per month, so they're really you're tapping into a good resource there. One recommendation I would make is if you are being solicited by a broker and exchange operator which you have never bumped into at a Nanog or an Aaron or a Ripe or an APNIC, delete the email, hang up the phone. You really want to be working with people who are active in the space, who know the business, know the industry, and know the players in the space. So I would say your best bet is look at one of these conferences and talk to the brokers that you can actually see in person, that you've seen coming back again and again. One question I had is, you'd mentioned, David, in your slide that there are some cases where you might be speaking to a seller and they'll say, well, I have 90% ready now, and the rest of the 10% might be ready in the future. What would be your advice or recommendation if you find yourself in that position?
So, it depends on your situation. If you don't need that 10%, it's a good transaction, it's a qualified seller, it's someone you're comfortable doing business with, the price is right, go for it. You structure the terms and conditions of the contract to ensure that there are penalties or there are motivations for them to follow through and deliver future tranches as they're clean. You follow up, engineer to engineer. People generally act in good faith if you found a good buyer, and if you're a qualified seller, people they're just trying to do business, right? So it's increasingly common, as far as I can tell, that you're not going to get all the space right away. So you have to be flexible, and you have to be flexible in your terms. And you have to understand the seller's trying to make a sale, so you need to work with them and put yourself in their shoes and say, well, what would you do? And go with it.
I would just sort of preface that by saying that's very much true for large sales. If you're looking at buying a /16 or smaller and the entity you're working with can't get off of the space all at once, keep looking. There's a ton more space out there, especially if it's less than a 16. So that's really that's a large buyer problem.
It's Vince Cerf from Google. A couple of questions. First one is there any kind of a reputation system that would help someone figure out if they are speaking to a reputable broker or agent?
Not that I'm aware of.
There's no gossip sheet somewhere.
So
Okay.
you can become a registered facilitator with the RIRs that have transfer policies in place. Although when we signed up, I'm pretty sure we just had to sign a document and pay $500. I'm not sure. There wasn't a ton of vetting going on there.
Yeah, it's a very young market, and the opaqueness sometimes works against us.
Yeah, I would say maybe ask for references and look at the types of organizations that they're giving you references from. Are they organizations that you've heard of?
So the second observation is when I hear terms like purchase and asset, that makes me nervous. Some of you will have watched the IANA transition debates and actions that were taking place very close to the transition point. An argument was being made that an asset of the government was being transferred. This is not helpful. I gather it's almost impossible to stop, but we have the same problem with domain names. People speak as if they own them, but they really only have a license to use. I noticed that you were careful to say that ARIN refers to license. There are good reasons for that, to protect the whole system. But I gather that our friends outside the U.S. don't have the same litigious concerns that we do.
Yeah, I'll share something with the audience. John Curran, the CEO of ARIN, has been very loud and upfront over the last year and a half that IP addresses are not an asset as far as ARIN is concerned. They are a license. And this didn't sit all that well with me. So the company I work for is spending a lot of money. So I wanted to make sure we got it right. So we invested some money and some time in a lot of lawyers to do months of research and really look at this. And in the United States, and under US law, we came to the conclusion that ARIN's position, that Vint has expressed very well, is 100% backed up by the law. These are not yours, these are not assets. And that's where you got to be really careful in that first paragraph of that contract, that asset purchase agreement. It's not yours. You're going to use it. You're basically going to think about it like yours because they're on a network and hopefully they're going to be there for decades, but it's not an asset. And Vint is saying software is starting to turn into that as well. So, look,
just a minor language point, there's a difference between an asset and property. So you can have a contract right that is an asset, but it doesn't mean you own it like property. But I think that what we're getting at here is the property question. And in North America, they treat it as a contract right. But there are all sorts of contract rights that you can buy and sell that doesn't make it your property. It just means you're assuming somebody else's position within that contract. But it's still, an asset of your organization.
Kevin
Bloomberg. So thankfully, Vint brought up the regulation of brokers where there really isn't any. And just to add to the concern, I have seen brokers at multiple conferences, ARIN and NANOG, and Barnum and Bailey would be proud. Just because you've seen them in the halls, the stuff that they're selling is ridiculous. So what I'd actually like to ask each one of you is, can you sort of point out the best, not even, fraudulent's the wrong word, the biggest exaggeration, the biggest crap you have seen from pseudo-brokers in our industry, something that really stood out? And I'll actually start with you. My favorite was the broker who tested his seller's space, and in doing so, got it listed on every blacklist out there and made it unsaleable. That's stupidity, not malicious, but stupidity. So do you have any good stories in that regard?
I recently had a fun fraud case. I'm helping somebody get some space back that was fraudulently taken from them. There was another broker. I'm still working out the details. I'm not going to assign any blame or name any names, but it looks like there was a broker that was involved with submitting some fraudulent documentation that included a notarized signature from somebody that had been dead for 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. The stories I could tell. I spent 10 years at ARIN fighting fraud. I've seen a lot of it. When I had a broker this week offer a tranche of a /12 to me for $15, an IP address, which it's an opening number. It's fine. It's not that irregular today. And they said, but I have a different seller who has 40 different blocks that together comprise almost a /12, and he's willing to sell them to you for $9. Gosh, why do you think that is? Why, when a broker comes to you and has two what they think of as equivalent block sizes and two completely different prices, one of which is completely below market, You got to ask yourself why. And that really, I looked at that email from the broker, and he and I have known each other a long time, so email's fine. And I said, you know, why, this guy doesn't get it. This guy doesn't realize that when you're dealing with these people who are just scamming for bucks. You're not helping anybody.
Although one thing I'll say in defense of brokers, that'll give you two different prices. Sometimes we do have clients that have different timing requirements, especially if you're working with like a bankruptcy estate or something where there's a limited time period where they need to get those funds in. Sometimes they can provide you with a credible backstory of why one seller might be willing to sell for below market value.
But you're probably upfront about
Yeah,
that.
they should tell you about that,
Yeah.
right? And if they don't ask about it, make sure it makes sense.
Yeah, that's one of
Because
those, hey,
sometimes
I've
there
got a
are
great deal
realistic
for you.
stories for why
Yeah.
something is priced at below market.
Yeah. So. I see someone at the microphone.
John Curran, CEO, Aaron. If you're, there's a lot of reputable, useful brokers out there. If you're a emerging, creative broker who's attempting to make a quick money by getting people to send it to you, don't start off by putting an offer together to sell an IP address block that's not registered to you and then spamming me with your offer. That's not productive.
Hey, Donnie?
There we go. Thank you very much, Amy and David. That was wonderful. Very good talk. It's my pleasure.